Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, this is our final episode on the topic of transportation. In terms of the current status in the US of these different modes of transit, so in terms of funding mechanisms, in the US, we used to have, before cars existed, we had dense urban centers similar to modern Europe. And there was actually a decent amount of you know things like rail cars and trams and stuff, like even cities like Los Angeles. Like I think there's like I think like Who Framed Roger Rabbit or something was about the whole like rail cars being taken away from LA or something like that.
Oh, I haven't seen that movie in so long.
Yeah. So
I don't
anyways,
remember that part.
the but basically the national highway system was built, and a lot of city centers had highways kind of pushed through them, and so that all happened. In terms of auto, there's a gas tax, and so there's a federal gas tax as well as smaller gas or state gas taxes. So the federal tax is not inflation indexed, so that presents problems in terms of dropping dropping revenue. So, how much tax do we pay on a gallon of gasoline and a gallon of diesel fuel? So, at the federal level, it's 18.4 cents per gallon for gasoline and 24.4 for diesel. And then the average of total state taxes for gasoline is 32.61 cents, for diesel 34.76 cents. Part of the reason gas is so expensive in Canada or in California is because they have a very high gas tax in California. So it says 68.1 cents per gallon in California, the highest in the entire country. In Alaska, which is the lowest, it's 8.95 cents per gallon. So a decent amount of transit is directly funded through gas taxes. So basically,
I've always heard that.
yeah. So basically, it's a sort of usage-based system, which is kind of different from a lot of other services that are provided by the government. So there's a highway trust fund that was established in 1956. This is according to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. So so you have a highway trust fund, and then you also have state funding. So the federal government funds about 1/5 of highway infrastructure in the U.S. About 22% is funded through federal taxes, and then about 78% through state and local governments. So mostly still funded through state mechanisms, although you do have federal funding. And the Highway Trust Fund is projected to accumulate a funding shortfall of around $280 billion from 2024 to 2034. So there are long-term solvency issues coming up. But historically,
I've always heard that this is one of the things that bullies states into following rules. Like, I think the famous example is that all states were forced to have the drinking age increased to 21 so they could get highway funding.
yeah, so there's some constitutionality issues around. So, like, if it's something that's sort of tied to the purpose of the funding. So in the case of the drinking age, you could argue, well, lower drinking age leads to more drunk driving. And so you can kind of tie it to automobiles. But then, there's a constitutionality question if it's like, completely unrelated. It's like, hey, like we're going to withhold highway funds if you like, I don't know, pick your sort of culture war issue or whatever. Then it gets a little shadier where it's like, okay, like, is this allowed? And then the reality is there is, rural because there's a large component of usage fees through gas taxes. That means that less used roads are subsidized compared to more used roads. And so rural roads tend to be less utilized because there's fewer people in rural areas. And so rural roads actually tend to be subsidized by people who live in suburban and urban areas.
I tried to tell someone from a rural area that I subsidized their road, and they still beat me up.
Well, it's kind of interesting because a lot of I've talked about this before, but a lot of the rural lifestyle in the US is heavily, heavily subsidized through taxpayer
Oh, I
funding.
mean, especially any sort of farming,
Yeah.
big time.
Farming is heavily subsidized. There's a lot of, import. You do have certain tariffs, and then you also have export control or not export controls. You have export subsidies, and you have like all sorts of insurance schemes and things like that, which is kind of interesting because a lot of rural areas are very, very anti-government. So it's kind of ironic that they often
Yeah.
rely heavily on the government.
Have we done an agriculture episode?
We have not, but I really want to do that. We should do that next.
Yeah, we
'Cause
should. That would be a good one.
There's a lot to talk about. And
Because it's, yeah, I mean, just Green Revolution on is kind of interesting, and the way like all. Yeah, all right, we'll save that for that episode.
so, anyways, when it comes to rail, so the big difference is, so there's an article about this from University Transportation Center for Mobility, and this is from Texas A&M. Yeah, this is from 2007, 2009, something like that. But basically, the key thing is there is no dedicated federal funding source for rail, so it's a lot more discretionary, and a lot more kind of sensitive to political stuff, basically. And rail does have a bigger component of actual user fees that you directly pay. Although, like a gas tax is kind of like that because you're paying, because gas is basically correlates with the number of miles you drive. So a gas tax is sort of an indirect per mile user fee. But rail, you usually have to like directly pay a ticket, right?
Yeah,
Some
every time you take a trip.
Yeah, some areas, when it comes to metro systems, so some cities have trip cost. The trip cost depends on how many stations you travel, and then some places it's basically like the same flat cost, regardless of how long your trip is. So those are kind of two different models
Yeah,
that exist.
DC's depends on where you come off, right?
Yeah, yeah. Which is probably the way it
That's
should
right.
be because it's the more you utilize it, the more you have to pay into the system, which I think makes sense.
Yeah.
So you added some comments on both of these. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah. Well, I guess yeah, because they'll kind of be segue into the next section anyway. Well, people always say that America is always going to be a car-based society because we're so individualistic, and cars are super individualistic because it is your personal mode of transportation, and then there's kind of a sense of freedom. You can go anywhere you want at a drop of a hat. No one can stop you as long as the roads are in decent condition. Drop whatever post-apocalyptic movie and someone's driving out of town in a car, even though in that situation the highways would be jam-packed.
Yeah.
On top of that, and this is my other criticism of rail is I think the only problem with rail in America is there's just not enough of it. Like in my city, people complain about it all the time. I'm like, well, if you live close to it, you would love it. But, if you don't, then you hate it.
It's not, I don't think it's a matter of not having enough of it. I think it's a matter of just, just urban design. The denser an urban area is, the easier it is to walk to a rail system. But I think if you have a really dispersed, low density or medium density city, it's just like, I guess you could build, a ton of train stations, but it would cost so much money to do it.
That wouldn't be worth it.
Yeah. So I think, well, the thing is like really good rail systems. You basically you have the main train station, and this is the way it is in DC. So they like the DC station, the Union Station, which for some reason there's like 20 different Union stations in the US. But actually, there's a reason for that. So unions. So in the old days, a lot of stations were like serviced a specific train company. But if you had a station that had multiple train companies that used it, it was called the Union Station because it was a combination of all the different, train companies. But still a confusing way of naming things. But yeah, I mean, in DC, the train station's like, a couple blocks from Capitol Hill. Like it's like pretty close to the. It's sort of basically part of the greater kind of downtown core, basically, right? And
Yeah.
you could basically like quickly take a cab there or whatever, and that's like, and this is like the train station that goes to other cities, not the metro system. Um, and so I mean, it's just the train. The main train station is like basically within the sort of greater downtown, and it's close to a lot of amenities. So it's close to like hotels and it's close to restaurants. It's like part of the sort of basic design. But a lot of places in the U.S., like you'll have stations in like the weirdest places. Like there's this one this one metro stop that I utilize, or not the one that I use, but it's like on the line that I use. But like the stop is like in between two like highway roads, basically. And so basically,
Hmm.
like you have to like take a sort of pedestrian bridge to get to the other side of like the highway to like leave the station, and then you have to walk like 3 blocks or 4 blocks to get to the closest, place where they have like basic stores and stuff. So it's just in this really weird out of place area. A lot of
Huh.
places have park and rides. So basically, the train station is just surrounded by like a massive parking lot. And so the
Well, that's what makes the most sense in my head. Is for a city with suburbs, you have a bunch of spokes going out, and then at the edges in each suburb, you'd have a park and ride.
Yeah, parking ride's better than nothing, but it's still, I think it's sort of like putting a band-aid on a problem. And I think the underlying problem is that like you need a dense urban design for public transit to really work. It
Yeah.
just doesn't work well otherwise.
Well, it works best with that, but I think it would be better than doing neither.
Yeah, I mean, so right now transit in the US is constrained by demand. It's not constrained by supply. There's just not enough people using it. So, anyways,
That's true for a lot of places. Yeah.
so it's a segue into
Well,
the
I
next.
think a lot. My city's using it a lot more. I've noticed that there's been an uptick.
So that perfectly segues into the next section. This is almost repetitive, but there's an article. There's an article that talks about the relationship between density, transit, and household expenditures in small urban areas. And this is the Transportation Research Interdisciplinary Perspectives Journal, and the author is Jeremy Matson for this paper. And it says the estimated elasticity of transit ridership with respect to density is 0.09. So is that just a correlation? Is that like
Let me see here.
elasticity of transit ridership? And density is associated with a 0.9% increase in ridership. That's like kind of low, to be honest.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'd imagine there'd be more
Yeah.
correlation there. Huh. Well, how do you measure density versus ridership?
Well, density is the number of people per given square footage. And then there's a
Okay,
relationship
let me
between.
look at these. Let me look at these estimates here. Log of vehicle. So this regression model has an intercept log of vehicle revenue hours, log of frequency, log of span, fare. Oh wow, fare is negatively correlated more than density is positively correlated.
So
Oh, that's
basically, that means the
interesting.
more expensive the fare is, fewer people use it.
Yeah. College population low, no vehicles. So that makes sense that log of frequency would be also correlated about the same as density. What is log of span?
Frequency and span of service. Service span was measured as the average number of hours per day that fixed route service is available. So that's basically
Oh,
the start and stop time of service.
well, that makes a lot of. Okay, well, that makes the most sense. Is the more. Okay, so that's the most correlated aspect is the more hours that it's available, the more people are going to use it.
it's kind of a chicken and egg.
Yeah.
It's a chicken and egg problem though, because
It totally is.
the more reliable it is, the more frequent services and the longer services available, more people use it. But if you don't have those things and you want to increase those things, you need a rationale. Planners and city council has to decide whether to spend more money. But if they're like, well, no, nobody's using it, then they won't do it. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. It seems like.
Yeah, totally is. Well, that's why I go back to my phrase is the one problem is that there's not enough of it. And well, that's what they did this year. They made a big announcement this year that they were going to do more frequent train stops during rush hour times. And ever since they did that, the times got better, but also more people started using the trains.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then Table 6 predicts likelihood of any transit commuter in census block group from a binary logit model.
Logits.
And it seems like the highest is if you're a household with no vehicle, well, obviously.
Yeah, you're going to
And
use
then
it a
college
lot.
population, interestingly. Although college towns also tend to have more dense designs typically. So that's all very interesting.
Yeah, that one all makes sense. Yeah.
Well, how about that?
Well, that's a good paper.
Yeah. And then there's also the bureaucracy issue. So this was what I talked about at the very beginning of this episode. Basically, per Eno Center of Transportation, our thorough review reveals inadequate governance, cumbersome processes, and outdated standards cost U.S. transit projects dearly. While there's no single cause for high cost and long timelines, the compounding effects of these issues creates an environment of inefficiency. So essentially, in other countries, basically the regulatory agencies have a lot more authority to just kind of basically push forward with construction of new lines and things like that. Obviously, there's environmental laws, et cetera, that have to be followed, but there's a lot more empowerment of the agency to coordinate and get things done. Whereas in the U.S., the Department of Transportation doesn't really do that. They're more about like giving grants
No.
out to people, but they don't have like if you have let's say you have a train system going from one state to another, the Department of Transportation can't just be like, okay, we're going to be the approval authority and we'll just make sure this gets pushed through. Instead you have to kind of coordinate between like 12 different agencies, between like local cities and environmental reviews, and then sort of impact statements, and you have to have kind of like local local meetings where people kind of discuss their grievances, and it's just this like a lot more cumbersome process, and so that's a huge issue. And then also
Yeah.
there's just project management practices are not quite as good compared to a lot of other countries, specifically in terms of building transportation infrastructure. So that's also a pretty big problem. And then finally, according to this Vox article, a huge issue is that in America, public transit is viewed as a form of welfare, whereas in Europe, it's viewed as a utility. So,
Oh my gosh, that is so true.
yeah. So that's a big sort of
Yeah.
political roadblock, basically.
Which is why one of my circle jerk arguments I put on there is one of the big reasons a lot of people in the U.S. don't take the bus or transit, but especially the bus, is it just feels low class to some people.
That is very true in my experience talking to people. It's just viewed as like a thing that poor people do, basically.
Yeah. And it's wild, like with all the congestion in my area, like I'm not even that far from my work,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes me about 35 minutes to take the train to my place, which includes about 3/4 to a mile of walking and a transit. So that's 35 minutes. In rush hour traffic, it takes about the same amount of time.
Wow. Interesting.
And I'm just like, I don't, yeah, I don't know why I would drive unless it was like pouring down rain or something.
Yeah, ultimately, people choose whatever's most convenient. So that's, like I said before, it's time, and then it's, comfort, and then it's cost. And so, in places where rail is more convenient, people will take it. So it really depends on your location.
Oh, big time.
In terms of controlling externalities, so there's a few ways of doing it. So in terms of congestion and noise, so congestion pricing is basically where at peak hours you basically charge people a toll to enter a certain area. So there's this paper by Louis Leahy, I think, called Downtown Congestion Pricing in Practice. Not a lot of information here. They just kind of talk about the different cities that have it. So Singapore, London, Stockholm, Milan, and Gothenburg. Probably pronounced that wrong. But they have
And
congestion
that's a
pricing.
2019 study.
Yes.
This is, and we're recording this like a couple months after New York put theirs in.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting. So the people who live in Manhattan, because it's a Manhattan congestion pricing thing, the people who live in
Yeah.
Manhattan are huge fans of it. It's really reduces congestion, reduces noise, etc. And it's had a dramatic effect. And they've done polling, and the people who are most against it are a lot of people who live in, there's people who live in Long Island who have to pay the toll. And then there's also a lot of people upstate who like it doesn't apply to because they like almost never go to New York City, but they're like super against congestion pricing.
Even though they don't even go to the city.
Yeah. I guess it's just like a culture war thing.
Oh my god. Well, that's just like how everyone's obsessed with like things going on in California, even if they've never really been there.
Yeah. I mean,
Like, I don't know why you care this much about LA wildfires, Mr. like whoever that lives in Florida. Like, why don't you like criticize your own insurance problems with the hurricanes than the insurance problems with people that live in the forest?
yeah. So like
Anyway,
for me, it seems pretty, I guess, like, congestion is a real externality. It makes accidents more likely. It increases pollution and it increases noise. So it's not great. And I think it's pretty straightforward. Like if you have an externality and there's a viable way to internalize it to the person who's doing it, it seems pretty obvious to me. I think a lot of people view this as like a big government thing. That's kind of the criticism.
Well, I read a study about the congestion in New York City was getting so bad that there was like a 1-to-1 correlation between congestion and hey, I'm walking here's per density person mile.
Yeah. Well, and the problem when things get really congested and when there's a lot of parking, looking for parking is like you'll have people like circle a block for like 10 minutes.
Oh, did you ever watch the How To with John Wilson?
No.
He has a whole it's just like this guy that like walks around with a camera talking about doing things in New York, and it just kind of like flutters around. You kind of have to watch it, but he has a whole episode that's just about finding a parking space in New York City. It's a phenomenal show if you haven't watched it.
Yeah, so we'll talk about parking externalities next. But yeah, from in terms of congestion pricing, it seems pretty, because I think a lot of people view downtown as like a place they go to. They're like, oh, downtown's where the theater is, so I can watch like freaking Cats or whatever. But it's like, well, people also live downtown, and I think a lot of people don't really kind of factor that in. But for me, like it seems like a pretty obvious policy. And then this paper. So the next issue is parking. So there's a compelling argument that street parking is severely underpriced in most cities. So the way you know that is, well, there's also parking garages that charge for parking.
Oh yeah,
and the parking garages are usually substantially more expensive than the street parking. And so I think that shows.
Yeah, typically.
I think that shows, well, we know what the market price is for parking because that's what the parking garages charge. And the street parking, probably should also be as high, and the reason why is if you don't sort of allocate based off of price. You end up allocating by queuing or by rationing. And in the case of parking, you're basically rationing by time, by queuing. So
Well, here's my guess on why street parking is usually undervalued compared to like garage parking is I think most street parking is done by the city, while a parking garage would be like it's all privatized.
yeah, yeah, it is. But
I think there's a road nearby that's like a main strip with a bunch of shops in the neighborhood, and the city was about to put in some street parking meters, and the neighborhood fought it and stopped them from putting it up because they're like, yeah, we don't want this here.
yeah, so I think the thing though is, number one, like street parking, that's still real estate that has a value, you know, and I think there's an argument to be made like, hey, you should pay to have that, to rent that value for 30 minutes or an hour or whatever. And also, when you have underpriced parking, a lot of times people will circle the block for like 10 minutes, and that just adds to traffic. So I think there are externalities to underpriced parking where you just have like a lot more traffic because of people looking for parking and stuff. So I think, should there be dynamic parking pricing so that if there's higher demand for parking, you make the prices more expensive? That could be another way to encourage more people to use public transit, you know.
Yeah.
But there's this paper.
Oh, totally.
In this paper, I'm a little hesitant to kind of talk about it because, well, so it says welfare implications of congestion pricing evidence from SF Park, from Feldman, Lee, and Tsai. And so it says, we find that congestion pricing increases consumer and social welfare by more than 4%. Question being, like, what is that metric? I'm sure if we read the paper, it'll say. And then it reduced search traffic by more than 10% in congested regions compared to fixed pricing. So, I honestly, I think it makes sense. I don't know if it'd be politically viable because people got mad when, I think it was like McDonald's or Wendy's or whatever, did congestion pricing. They did like demand-based pricing, dynamic pricing for.
People are starting to use it a lot more often. I think restaurants are starting to do congestion pricing. Like it's more expensive during your meal times.
Well, that's what happy hours are.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Happy hours are kind of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anyways, there's all that.
Next to the next circle jerk argument there is, will one more lane fix the problem?
So if the problem is congestion, the answer is no. If the problem is total throughput, the answer is yes, because if there's more lanes, then there's more cars per lane. So there is more throughput in total. But if you don't have, like, if you don't basically, one way of managing demand is through prices, right? And you can do that with roads through tolls, but most roads are not toll roads. And so if you don't have tolls, yes, you're paying for gasoline, but really you end up basically rationing based off of how much people are willing to deal with traffic, essentially, which is, I guess, a form of time-based rationing. But if you go to this article below that comment you added, so this is a pamphlet from the Washington State Department of Transportation. On page 4, there's a graph that looks at the maximum throughput, looking at speed versus volume per lane. So volume of vehicles per hour per lane. And basically, total throughput is maximized at about 45 miles an hour. And the reason this is because essentially, I mean, if speed is very high, there's more, obviously a car goes through much faster, but there's usually fewer cars on the road. Because if you have a ton of cars on the road, you can't drive that fast because it's dangerous, right? And so usually at high speeds, throughput is lower because there's not as many cars there. But the flip side is if you add more cars and then it slows down to about 45 miles an hour, it's slower, but there's more cars. And then eventually, the more cars you add, things slow down even more, and then the loss of speed predominates. despite there being more cars, and it ends up reducing throughput, total cars per hour per lane. So 45 miles per hour is roughly kind of the optimal if what you care about is throughput. But the problem is when each time you add a lane, essentially there's induced demand. And so at first, it reduces traffic, but then people who otherwise would not have used the road are like, oh, there's not as much traffic, so now I'll drive, whenever to do XYZ. And so it ends up inducing demand and leads to the same traffic, basically.
Or the person that would be okay or wanted a house closer to not deal with traffic goes, oh, but now I can afford a bigger house further out.
Yeah. So total throughput does increase because if, like let's say before you added the lane, the cars all drove at like 30 miles an hour because of traffic. And then you add the lane, traffic eventually goes back to what it was before, but now there's an extra lane. So total throughput is higher, but if what you care about is congestion and how fast the cars are going, then it does not fix the problem. And so certain parts of Texas, I feel like, are really bad with this, where they have like 20 lane highways and they're like, oh, we just gotta, we gotta keep adding lanes to make sure, and I just don't think that's great. The real solution is to either add tolls to the road or to provide public transit as an alternative. So another externality, fatalities from traffic accidents. So as far as this goes, there's a few things. So first, there's this paper basically looking at share of mass transit miles traveled and reduced motor vehicle fatalities in major cities of the U.S. by Stimson and others. And basically it says, after accounting for climate year and the economic cost of driving, an increased share of mass transit miles traveled per capita was associated with reduced motor vehicle fatalities. Not very surprising. So basically, and I think in the US, there's like 30,000 people who die per year driving or through auto accidents, which is like a really high number. Huh. Like how many other causes of death are that high? I guess things like, cancer and whatever.
Sure.
But
I knew it was going to be high, but I don't know. What are the cancer numbers?
It's got to be way higher, I think. Because, how many people do you know who've died in car accidents? Not many, right? Versus how many people do you know?
Yeah, not too many.
Versus how many people have, do you know who've died of cancer or heart disease or whatever?
Well, I usually don't try and use my own anecdotal life as a gauge on these things.
Yeah.
Too much. Because I don't know enough people to have a significant guess on that one.
So here's an interesting thing. So Japan in 2000 and I'm using them as an example because they have a lot of rail. But in 2024, Japan had 2,663 traffic fatalities. So 2,663. And then the USA in 2024, in 2022, they had about 44,000 people die in motor vehicles or motor vehicle accidents. So the US number is like 10 to 20 times higher, but the US only has 3 times as many people. So that really shows a car-centered lifestyle is very, very dangerous from a fatality perspective. And then there's this paper, Understanding and Improving Arterial Roads to Support Public Health and Transportation Goals. They talk about arterial roads from various perspectives, but they do mention in one area that, it does lead to, research on road design and traffic suggests that arterials are an injury risk factor. So arterial roads are basically ones that connect neighborhood roads to highways.
I thought they were the ones that took the cars away from the heart.
Yeah, and then the vein roads take them back to the rest of the...
which is why arterial are more dangerous because people are trying to get home.
Yeah. So you have neighborhood roads, which are less dangerous because cars are slower because there's, narrow
Yep.
streets. And then highways are also not super dangerous because even though speeds are high, everyone's kind of separated from each other usually. And you don't have pedestrians. So sometimes, very very rarely, you do see people on the highway, and it's like a thing you tell your like family about. It's like, dude, there was a guy on the highway today.
What's he doing out there?
But arterials are kind of like, especially when you have retail on the side of an arterial road, which is a stroad, which is like the common way things are in the U.S. is like when you have
Oh
a
yeah,
ton of stores on the side of an arterial road, which is a very
we
dangerous.
live by the stroad.
It's a very.
I
dangerous,
think when people do the stereotypical like turning something into America, they just take a picture of a stroad.
but that's a very dangerous urban design because it's high speeds combined with pedestrians walking around everywhere.
We've definitely talked about this one on one of our episodes
We
before.
have, yeah. I don't think stroads should exist. I think retail should be spread out amongst the neighborhood mostly, or at least there shouldn't be as many of them. And then carbon pollution, there's fuel taxes, which already kind of exist, so that's kind of already been dealt with. I don't know if it fully captures the cost of carbon, but it's there. And then is there a way to tax automobiles more to subsidize public transit? That's a policy debate.
Yeah, that's a values debate.
Yeah. And then you added a comment here.
Well, in transportation, we always talk about working on the supply, but what do you think the effects are of working from home culture, which probably reduces the demand?
For sure it does. I think it certainly reduces demand via lack of commuting. It doesn't really deal with driving for like errands, like going to get stuff at the store or going to a restaurant. I think urban design, mixed use design is a better solution to that. But for sure, work from home reduces demand. There are other factors to work from home that I used to be a huge fan, and I kind of have a mixed view of it now. Like, I think one unexpected side effect is that it makes unionizing harder because
Oh yeah,
because unions happen. The reason unions really happened a lot in like blue collar work is because they're places where you require skills. So there's a certain level of demand, but not high enough skills where you kind of already have what you want, basically. So in the tech industry, like, you don't really have unions because people already get paid a lot. So they're like, okay, like, I'm good to go,
I don't know what I need a union for.
But also, retail and fast food and stuff, it's very hard to get unionizing done because, the skill as defined by how long it takes to learn how to do the job, I guess.
Well, I'm still looking for my working from home fast food job.
Right. So basically, unionizing. Well, first you need laws that protect unionizing efforts, and then you also need sort of a medium high level of skill needed, which is like blue collar trades, etc. And then you also need a place where people can congregate to organize and communicate, etc. So that's why, like, factories where you have a lot of people on the same floor who can talk to each other, things of that nature, you see a lot more unionizing. So
You would think this would make bosses super in favor of working from home.
yeah, maybe they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot through this go back to the office, mentality. So that's an unexpected side effect of work from home. I also kind of think a lot of the sort of people going crazy, going down social media rabbit holes, I feel like work from home made that way worse. Because before,
Oh yeah, definitely.
because before,
I mean, a lot of it, I think, everyone blames COVID, but I think a lot of it, like, really started peaking in 2022 when it was like, oh, yeah, working from home and hybrid working lifestyle is new normal, like, actually new normal.
yeah, because I feel like in the old days, like, there was just a time limit to how much time you could spend going down like the dark reaches of the internet. It's like, well, I'm at work until like 5 p.m. and I'm not going to like read conspiracy websites on my work computer. And then, I get home and then like there's a happy hour and then like, me and my, wife are going to go to some stupid, dinner thing or whatever. But once you started doing work from home, you could spend like hours and hours just like
Idle hands.
so yeah. Anyways,
We have to shackle the human race to an office and commuting to keep us up from going down the dark rabbit holes, apparently.
seems like it.
No, it's, well, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. This is a half-baked theory that I'm developing.
Yeah. I'm actively, this is a ongoing side conversation
Yeah.
we've been having for a while. I think dating apps might be a part of it too.
Yeah, for sure.
Because you don't have an excuse to like go to a community event. Anyway, we're getting off topic for transportation now.
Next topic. So technology. So I didn't
Flying cars.
So I chose not to make this a focus of this episode because based off my research, I just don't think technology is the bottleneck in transportation.
No, I don't think so either.
There is like with aircraft, could you make electric aircraft, supersonic aircraft, air taxis, etc.? For ground transportation, could you have, maglev trains? Could you do robo taxis? These things seem kind of, it seems like there's bigger fish to fry, essentially.
I think people figured out the light transit or light rail transit a long time ago. Like, it's basically more or less the same.
It's more, yeah, I think the solutions already exist. It's a matter of making sure policy and regulations exist to allow those solutions to be implemented in different cities. But like when you look at the current system of public transit options, light rail, buses, etc., like it's basically fit for purpose. Like what else do you really need? And a lot of the sort of like technological innovations are about making things even faster, like hypersonic, supersonic, air transit, etc. It just, like I think I would argue it's more important to just have higher throughput in terms of more people using public transit than just making a smaller number of people go really, really fast. It's just my opinion. And then with robo taxis, again, like, is robo taxis really more important than like better transit services? Like
one of the dystopian futures I always imagine is when self-driving vehicles really take off and everyone has their own self-driving car. So they take it into the office and then say, oh, great, now park yourself. And then like in the middle of the workday, it's super bad congestion because each self-driving car is looking for parking and it never finds it.
Dang.
I know. I'm going to write a book about it one day.
So to conclude, my main thoughts based off, everything we talked about is like, number one, we should have denser cities. And then number two, I think there should be an empowered decision-making agency for a given location to basically push through transit projects. If it's an interstate project, maybe it should be the Federal Department of Transportation. For internal to states, for inner city projects, maybe there should be a state agency that just like the buck stops with them and they make the decision. So that's my opinion.
That's also my opinion, but that is because I am an urbanist elite.
You're part of the elite.
If you're a salt of the earth type, you shouldn't believe me at all.
So
I have two remaining circle jerk arguments.
Go ahead.
One on the left and one on the right. Which I'll start with the left. Should private jets be banned? A lot of people hate on the private jets right now.
They are pretty bad for the environment, but I think they also exist for a reason, namely a lot of
I think they should just be taxed more.
I think that's a good argument. I'm a huge fan of luxury taxes because, basically if you're consuming something for the sake of showing off like how much money you have, then hypothetically a massive tax on top of that shouldn't bother you, right? Shouldn't that be even more of a status symbol? Like, hey, there's a massive, like, I have to pay like a 200% tax on this and I can still afford it because that's how much of a baller I am. So
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of like luxury taxes for like,
I think this is the case for that.
yeah, for like super high ticket items like private jets.
Yeah, because you're still going to have like some CEOs where it's like worth it to take a private jet because your time's worth so much.
Yeah, your time's worth a lot. And also, like, there are, like, it's one of those things where, like, maybe it's not, maybe it would be more, perhaps it's better for the environment if there was like a private jet bus service. So, like, all the CEOs would like rent out, schedule time to all show up together and take a private jet bus.
We need like an Uber X of private jets.
Yeah, so like you'll have like 20 CEOs all show up at the same time and fly somewhere.
I think it would lose the appeal at that point.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it should be luxury tax, but yeah, there's a lot of hate on that. That one. All right, second one, and this is the crazy one, and I've definitely heard people on podcasts talk about them. There's a conspiracy out there that the whole urbanists make you live in a single place, or so they call the 15-minute city concept, where you live in a place where you're a 15-minute walk from just about any convenience that you would need, is so that you don't have a car, and now you lose your autonomy of having a car. Do you what do you think about this one?
So, well,
this globalist conspiracy.
First, I don't believe it. First, there's no evidence that this conspiracy exists. But number two, like, so the globalist conspiracy is to return urban design to what it used to be, like in the 1920s, 1910s, and going all the way back to like antiquity. Like, are you saying that like before the 1920s, like every single city was like basically susceptible to like globalist takeover?
I think the globalists would be shooting themselves in the foot, and it's basically the same argument for working from home. People stuck in a city are way more likely to get angry at something and revolt.
So that's interesting. So yes, a dense urban area is probably easier to shut down through martial law in terms of shutting down all public transit, barricading the streets, etc. The flip side...
But basically all revolutions start in cities like that.
Exactly. The flip side is there's a higher density of people, and if there's a lot of people in a single place who are all communicating with each other and they're all upset, it's very easy for them to kind of get out on the streets and disrupt things. So an interesting thing is like rural areas. So if we're going deep down the rabbit hole of like martial law conspiracies, so rural areas are actually very hard to control because, it's an easy place for guerrillas to operate, etc. But also it's harder for uprisings to happen in rural areas. And then urban areas are the opposite. It's easier for martial law to be implemented, etc. But also it's easier for people to push back and organize. Suburban areas, the reality is like there's very little revolutionary activity that happens in suburban areas. Like you never really have like uprisings or like mass demonstrations happen like the freaking like the Kroger's parking lot, whatever. It just doesn't really happen. It's always in dense city centers. So,
oh yeah, always. Well, I guess like the big ones though can like last longer in the rural areas because, like, I guess like Mao kind of like got his foothold in the countryside.
Yeah, he did.
I'm trying to think of the other success stories for the rural revolutionary.
Those are more like insurgencies, like long term.
Yeah, it turned into an insurgency.
I think
I'm thinking about that one a lot because I'm reading that book about it.
I think a lot of the initial sparks, when you talk about revolutions, the initial sparks
almost always in the city.
Yeah, the Russian Revolution certainly did.
French Revolution almost always the city. 48's all the city.
Yeah. So
American Revolution, Boston.
Boston was like...
If it wasn't for Boston, I don't think it would have happened for years.
Like Boston was basically like, it was all, they were like the beating heart of like the American Revolution.
English Civil War, the Oliver Cromwell one. I think that one might have been a little rural. Wait, no, that one started in Parliament.
Yeah, which is in London, right?
Yeah. Never
Yeah.
mind.
So, I just, I mean, I don't,
Oh wait. No, Mexican Revolution. That one was pretty rural.
I don't really buy the argument that urban life would make people easier to control. I think,
Me neither.
I think usually it's the opposite. Where like, yes, there is like the aspect of it's easier to control, but also like even if you like shut down public transit, people can still ride bikes around and run around and stuff. So, I just don't buy it. I think when you look at
Yeah, me
revolutions
neither.
that like overthrow governments, it almost always is like mass uprisings in city centers. You know. So, anyways, that kind of wraps things up.
Yep, I'll call that one debunked.
All right, that was our final episode on transit. We'll come up with another topic next time.